What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and yes, today's the day we'll be talking about the Nikon Z8 versus the Canon R5 Mark II. So, with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started with the Nikon Z8 versus the Canon R5 Mark II, all of this is my own gear. I paid for all the gear myself. No one sent me anything. And also, I want to point out that I do use Canon for the channel for the last 3+ years. I have the R5C, the R6 Mark II, and also the R5 Mark II. And previously, I owned the R6 Mark I. I picked that up from Caleb Pike. I owned the RP, and I used the R3 and the R5 for a short period of time. So I'm very well versed in the Canon world. Now, for the Nikon world, if you guys watch the channel, you already know that I know Nikon inside out with the Z9, Z8, ZF, ZFCs, the Z6II, Z7II, Z50. If you watch the channel, you already know that I know Nikon already. So with all that context out the way, in this video, we'll definitely take a look at the Nikon Z8 versus the Canon R5 Mark II. So with all that said, let's take a look at the price. So the Nikon Z8 comes in at $3,800 USD, whereas the Canon R5 Mark II comes in at a whopping $4,300 USD. So throughout this entire video, you guys need to decide if that extra $500 is well worth it. So let's take a look at the specs. So the Nikon Z8 is a 45 megapixel full frame sensor. It shoots up to 20 frames per second. And as for the auto sensitivity level, it's -7 to 19. The body weighs about 820 grams, and this camera was released last year of 2023. Now, as for the Canon R5 Mark II, it's also a 45 megapixel full frame sensor. It shoots up to 30 frames per second, so we'll definitely see that in the buffering test. The autofocus sensitivity is -7.5 to 21, so we'll definitely see that in the autofocus test. And the body weighs about 588 grams, and this camera came out this past summer in 2024. Now, as for the video specs, the Nikon Z8 is offering more specs over the R5 Mark II on paper. But if you know me, it's not really about the quantity, it's about the quality of these features. So if you guys want to see a comparisons, definitely leave your comments down below. Also, just a side note, the R5 Mark II do offer a cooling system for an extra $500 USD, whereas the Nikon Z8, there's no cooling system for the Nikon Z8. So definitely it's going to overheat faster over the R5 Mark II. Even though the Canon might be more expensive to cool the system, at least there's an option for that. So there we go. Now, as we take a look at the back of the camera, the EVF on both systems is 0.5 inches, 100% coverage, but the Nikon is 3,690,000 dots, whereas the Canon is 5,760,000 dots, and they're both OLEDs. And also the monitor screen is 3.2 inch as usual, and they're both 2,100,000 dots. And of course, the Nikon is sporting a 4-axis tilting screen, whereas the Canon is sporting a articulating screen. And speaking about screens, I raised up the screen brightness for both systems, and here's my lux test. The Nikon is 568, whereas the Canon is 490, which means that Nikon is offering a brighter screen over the Canon. Now, as we take a look at the top of the camera, you'll notice that the Canon R5 Mark II do offer this big boy hot shoe cover, and yes, it does fit in your Nikon Z8 hot shoe, and no, you shouldn't do it because it wobbles, so just keep that in mind. Now, for the Canon hot shoe, it's a multifunction hot shoe which allows you to attach additional accessories to your systems, even an XLR mic, which Nikon is certainly missing in their system. So already Nikon do have a lot of features in video on paper, but when it comes to accessories to cool the system, to have an XLR mic, it doesn't have that just yet. Now, as for the battery portion, the Nikon is featuring the EN-EL15C, which is $60, whereas the Canon is featuring the brand new Canon LP-E6P, which is $80, so that's about a $20 difference. But the CIPA rating on the Nikon is 330, whereas the Canon is 540, which means the Canon, you'll be shooting more photos and also longer videos over the Nikon. So again, better accessories on the Canon over the Nikon. Now, as for the memory slots, they both sport one CF Express card slots and also one UHS-2 card slots. And speaking of card slots, let's take a look at the buffering. Now, I'm using the exact same CF Express card on both systems with the same exact 24mm Canon lens. Now, here is the Nikon at 20 frames per second. Now here is the Canon at 30 frames per second. And here is the Canon at 20 frames per second. Here is the audio levels. On top is the Canon R5 Mark II 30 frames per second. The second slot is the Canon R5 Mark II 20 frames per second. And the third slot is Nikon Z8 20 frames per second. And as you can see, the empty spots, the ones without any peaks, those are the buffering section. And the Nikon Z8 buffers a fraction of a second throughout my test, whereas the Canon, even at 20 frames per second, it will buffer. It'll buffer up to 3 seconds, and then you go into a half a second shootout, and then you go back to a 2 or 1 second buffer again, and just repeats. And so if you're shooting any sequence that is relatively longer than 5 seconds, definitely a Nikon Z8 is a camera that I would definitely recommend. Anything shorter, I would recommend the Canon, obviously, because you get the 30 frames per second at the initial start. Now, as for the ISO test, this is the electronic shutter versus the electronic shutter. I will say that I turned everything off in the camera, including the noise reduction on the Nikon. And I will definitely point out that throughout this entire test, the noise level is more or less the same until you hit higher ISO, which, by the way, you could fix all of this in post. So this is not a big deal to me. However, I do notice that the black on the Nikon is always darker than the Canon. And yes, I'm using the exact same lens on both systems. Now, as for electronic shutter versus mechanical shutter, I will say that both cameras perform more or less the same. Maybe if you're zooming in like 300+%, you might see a tiny difference, but it's not a huge difference. But if you take a look at the actual color swatches, some of it look very identical to one another, and there's a few that looks slightly off. So keep in mind, I'm using a Canon lens on both systems, and yes, the black on the Nikon looks slightly lighter on the Canon, whereas the blue on the Nikon, to me, it looks slightly purple on the Canon. But definitely leave your comments down below. Let me know what you guys think. Now, when it comes to color science, I'm still using the same lens on both bodies. I do notice that the Canon is slightly warmer than the Nikon, but there were some situations indoors where it looks more or less the same unless you zoom in 300% to really tell the difference. But at that point, you could just adjust the color. So just want to throw that out there. Color difference, minor, but definitely Canon is slightly warmer as usual. So there we go. Now here is the dynamic range test, electronic shutter. This is where I underexpose my shots and I pull out the exposure. And here is my results. Definitely the Canon is falling apart. It is falling apart. The blacks are no longer black. Yeah, it just turns purple. And also at 1600 is when both of the systems starts to shift colors. So definitely higher ISO with dynamic range push is pretty bad. So just keep that in mind. And here is the mechanical shutter. And I was so wrong about this. I thought that the Canon will outperform the Nikon, but unfortunately it does not. So when it comes to dynamic range push, the Nikon is still better at electronic shutter over the mechanical shutter on the Canon. Now, as for the next test, this is the autofocus test. I'm using 28mm from both brands. They're about the same value. Here is the video autofocus results. And as you can see, the Nikon has more eye tracking over the Canon, which has more box tracking. And also the Nikon can detect me more quicker than the Canon. And here is the next test. I'm using 50mm 1.8 from both brands. And so here is the results for video autofocus. And the Nikon looks more responsive, more intelligent in tracking me over the mannequin, whereas the Canon seems to always have this hard time in tracking me. I've seen this in the R6 Mark II. I've seen this in the R3. And let me tell you guys something. they have an issue with their autofocus system when it comes to folks that are wearing more than just a t-shirt. So I'm just going to throw that out there. If you've been following me on Instagram, you've seen everything live. There was no jump cuts, nothing. We tried to cheat for Canon actually. We tweaked the settings and still it does not perform better than the Nikon, unfortunately. And this is Nikon at default, by the way. So I don't know what Canon is doing. I hope they fix this down the road. And here is the photo autofocus with the 28mm. And as you can clearly see, definitely the Nikon can detect me more quicker than the Canon. And also we're getting more eye tracking from the Nikon over the Canon. And here is the 50mm in the photo autofocus. And the story remains the same. Definitely, I'm getting more eye tracking from the Nikon over the Canon. The Canon seems to be lacking behind. And this is pretty crazy because before, 3 years ago, it used to be the other way around. It seems like Nikon just quickly caught up. So good for Nikon. You're getting more eye tracking on the Nikon over the Canon. Now as for the autofocus for the bird tracking, I did this test a week ago on my Instagram and we did about 2 days of this with the 180-600 versus the 100-500, and we came to a conclusion that the Nikon can definitely autofocus on the bird much better than the Canon when it comes to low light situations. So if you're shooting low light a lot, Nikon will be your system right there, and it shows up also in your video autofocus as well. So there we go. Now as for the next test, this is my overexposed dynamic range test. I would overexpose my shot by 3 stops and I would bring it back down to 0 with the same exact lens for both cameras. And this is the electronic shutter. And as you can clearly see, the Canon loses its color. Unfortunately, it just doesn't look great when you pull back the dynamic range. It is pretty bad. And here is the mechanical shutter on the Canon versus the electronic shutter on the Nikon. And yes, unfortunately, the story remains the same. Canon loses its color when you're pulling the dynamic range back down to 0, whereas Nikon, it retains a lot of the color informations. So just wrap things up, the Canon R5 Mark II versus the Nikon Z8. Now, both cameras have their own pros and cons, so let's just talk about scenario-wise. If the scene is very optimal lighting condition, you have, perfect lighting, both cameras will do just fine. If you're shooting in low light conditions, definitely pick the Nikon. If you're shooting like long form video recording, get the Canon, right? Because Canon has an abundance of accessories to kind of complement the video recording, such as the AC unit, the XLR, and also a longer battery. So that is pretty awesome for the Canon to do that, whereas Nikon don't have any of that. So you need to kind of compensate a lot. You need to like turn off your camera to let it cool down, and also, change the battery here and there, and also buy a third-party XLR with a cable sticking out. So that's just inconveniency right there, but that's just something for you guys to definitely take note of. Also, if you're shooting wildlife, yes, Nikon can focus on the wildlife in low light conditions, no problem. Great dynamic range, as I said before. However, if the lighting condition is perfect, and you have the pre-capture on your Canon and you're shooting 30 frames per second, yeah, some people might choose the Canon over the Nikon if that's what you shoot all the time, in good lighting all the time. But if you're shooting a long sequence, definitely get the Nikon, because the Nikon do not buffer like the Canon. At the end of the day, I'm gonna leave the pickings up to you guys, but it's really up to you guys to do your own research. Go online, watch the other reviews, but just make sure you know that in my test, this is just, the extreme level of what if, right? What if I shot something really overexposed? What if I shot something that's very low light and I need to pull it back, right? What if I'm aiming at something in the darkness, So my tests are very extreme, and a lot of you guys may not even need all of that. A lot of you guys may be okay with just, normal shooting. Your lighting conditions is always perfect. You don't need to worry about low light, or maybe you're working in a studio, or you could own a Nikon Z8 and do long form video recording just by having the AC turned up, or you're filming in the wintertime. So it really depends on your situation. So with all that said, thank you guys for checking me back. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely click like and subscribe, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, take it easy. Peace.